Our subject for tonight is titled The Spirit of Law. Over the last 2 weeks, we've been talking on law from various perspectives. We started by defining law. We looked at law from the context of the law of the land. We looked at natural laws. We looked at divine laws. We even looked at ritual laws and how all of these differ from one another. And we did mention that law absolutely uh, governs our nations. And we also did say that law is inherent in creation. So tonight, we'll probably just pick up from where we stopped and talk around a few things still on law, and then drive in as we talk about the spirit of law. What do we mean by that? But before we go on, let's just look at what our objectives are tonight. First, we want to look at understanding the purpose of kingdom laws. Let's not forget that when we talk about law on this platform, our emphasis is more on kingdom laws, which is how kingdom laws, or we talk from the perspective of kingdom, which we did justice to a few weeks ago. And of course, we will continue to look at the kingdom perspective as we go on. So that absolutely is the foundation of all that we do on this platform. So when we talk about understanding the kingdom laws, what exactly do we mean? Where are we heading to when we talk about that? We also want to look at understanding the intent of law. What do we mean by the intent of law? Okay, and then we want to look at how law shapes values and attitudes. How law shapes values and attitudes, and how to reawaken conscience by kingdom laws. Now, let me just state here before I go on, for people who are attempting to join, if for any reason you have any troubles or you can't hear me, just refresh your screen and I'm sure everything will be fine. And from our side here, we're trusting that we'll have very solid connection so that we can go through without any interruption. All right, so I would like to begin by talking or by sharing on the prevalence of law. And one of the things that we mentioned in the last 2 weeks was that law is inherent in creation. So I'll just pick up from there to say that law is actually inherent in all things. Talking about this over the past few days, I was thinking very deeply about this, and I was considering the human body, for example, how that everything we do is governed by law. There's a law that seems to be built into our very existence and the way life itself functions. Not to even mention the plants, the natural habitat, and the outer space and all that. So law is actually inherent in all things. In fact, it seems that the creator purposefully built law into everything he created. Not just that, we also see that law actually governs all of our relationships. Everything we do in society, when I buy something from a product maker, from a shop, or from the internet, I expect that thing to be delivered to me. There's a law that says if that doesn't get delivered, there are X, Y, Z courses of actions that are open to me. So we can probably just leave it at that by saying that, yes, indeed, law is inherent in all things. Not only that, we see that because law is inherent in everything, then law actually governs everything. And when we say governs, we are talking in terms of the fact that law actually presides over everything. Law rules everything. Now, these are sweeping statements, but the ramifications of them are so far reaching. They are very, very true. Now, law, because they are inherent in everything, because law governs everything, we begin to observe that law actually simplifies life. What do we mean by that? Okay, if I put food into my mouth, now I expect that it goes through my gut, landing into my stomach. Once it gets to my stomach, I'm not in control of what happens anymore. I expect things to happen like the gastric juices there, or gastric acids there taking over, and then turning the food on into something that my body can assimilate. But from the point where it leaves my hand into my mouth and I swallow the food, I have no control. But then there seems to be this simplicity built into uh, into the digestive system, such that when anything goes in, it has a particular path that it will take until it exits the body. So that tells us that, you know law actually makes life predictable, and because life is predictable, we can almost predict the result of things. Talking about that, this is the reason why, whether we talk about engineering or other areas of study, the fact that law makes things predictable is the reason why we can plot the trajectory of a spacecraft as it leaves Earth to go to the moon. It's the same reason why, for people who are probably conversant with computing, you can expect that one and zeros will always be the base of all that you do. And so, because of that law, you can then build complexities on them. That's how come we have so many programs that we use to date. Not just this, law actually makes things predictable in the sense that if I can tell what the outcome of something is, then I can act based on that, expecting the outcome to be consistent. So the reason why we have that assurance is because there is a law that governs life. The same thing with the law of motion. I know that if I push the gear of my vehicle, I expect it, and I follow just the law of operating the vehicle. I expect it to move. Now, if it does not move, it does not function as intended, then that becomes a surprise to me. And in fact, sometimes it alarms us, and then we begin to seek ways to seek redress, to find way to correct what we expected to be the course of action. So, in effect, law actually protects life. We did say some time ago that when somebody says, do not operate this inside water, it's not so much for um, prevention. It's not meant to hamper us. It's actually meant to protect us. So the laws that are in life are actually meant to protect everything in existence. That is why when astronauts go into the outer space, they have to wear a particular kind of clothing that makes them to be able to function when they are in space. Otherwise, they just simply, maybe the pressure there takes over, and life becomes totally unbearable, maybe even lost. So, in a nutshell, we find out that there's nothing that exists without law. Nothing can exist without law. Absolutely nothing. Okay. Now, violation of law, we saw as we discussed over the last 2 weeks, introduces complexity to life. So, whereas life was meant to be simple based on adherence to law, anytime a law is violated, complexity is introduced and life becomes unbearable. Now, an example is this: our body clocks are set to operate in a particular way. So, which means if we sleep at night, normally, our bodies will function. Certain parts of our body do certain things at different times of the day. For example, our largest intestine sort of do its main work between 5 and 6 5 and 7 a.m. in the morning. So the mind, the brain also has its own way of resetting itself as we sleep. Now, medical science research that I read in the last few weeks show that when people, maybe for some reason, they miss the normal hours of sleep, something, a kind of stress begin to build up in the body, because the body clock begins to reset in a particular way. So we can see that even nature agrees that when laws are violated, complexity sets in. And all that we do really in life is that we create certain laws that alter the simplicity of life, and then we begin to manage the complexities. So, but let's go on. And as we look at purpose and natural laws, law originates from the mind of the creator of a product. This is, I mean, I will almost say it's an absolute statement. Why do I say this? When I create a product, I at the same time determines how it should operate. Now, my instruction on how that product should operate is the law that I build into that product. This product is not to be operated inside water, or where it should not be exposed to moisture. This product will not function in excessive heat. These are laws that are built into the product, and the creator of such product expect those laws to be kept in order that the guarantee that it gives for the functioning of the product to be kept. Now, the purpose of a product determines the law that governs the product. Whatever we intend a product to do, to achieve, will determine the kind of law that we build into it. All right. So we know that products that are meant to function by electricity have already in them the design and the tools to take in electricity and convert them to other forms, either to mechanical energy or other forms, to produce the intended function. Right? Now, the intent of a product determines the law it must submit to in order to function. For example, look at our vehicles. A petrol car has to submit to the law of petrol in order to function. If somebody puts diesel, for example, mistakenly into a car, a petrol engine, well, it's a given that that car will cease to function. So a diesel engine has to submit to the law of diesel in order to function. I remember some of this in cars where we have what's the name of this thing called? Where we pour in water. Water has to be poured into that component of the engine in order for the car to function, to cool down the engine. Otherwise, the car will overheat and things will burn out in the car. So whoever creates a thing reserves the right and does in fact determines the law of its existence. So which means what this tells me is that before I can alter a thing, I have to be sure about the mind of the person that created it. If I act consistent with the law that the creator of it put in place, I can expect the thing to continue to function. In fact, I can preserve its existence. Otherwise, the thing will cease to function and just goes out of existence. Now, we said a lot about natural laws, and I'm just going to restate some of those things and add a few things. That creation laws are actually natural laws. Everything we find in creation as established by God are natural laws. An example, I expect the lion to be in savanna grassland. I don't know of any lion that we find in the Arctic. We find polar bears there, but a polar bear will not function if it's brought into a rainforest or the savannah. It just wouldn't function. Why? The law that keep a polar bear functioning requires it to stay in that kind of cold. Now, existential laws determine what a thing needs in order to survive and thrive. By this, I will just use an example. A seed needs soil in order to survive and to thrive. If I place a seed on the pavement of the house, it will be there unless maybe a bird comes to pick it up, but it will be there and nothing will happen. But that that seed of corn in the right soil just simply begins to thrive and takes on a life of its own. So whatever something needs to exist reveals the law of its nature. In fact, I'll say it this way: need is proof of law. Okay, I'll say that in another way. When we see a particular need that something has in order for it to survive, that indicates a particular law it has to submit to in order to survive. Okay, so our bodies, for example, are made up of over 70% of water. So the body, therefore, needs water in order to survive. So it's not a question of whether the body wants water. No, there is a law that says the body must be hydrated sufficiently in order to continue to function. So whatever something needs to exist reveals the law of its nature. And when we talk about the law of its nature, we are simply saying something that is natural to that thing. So water, for example, is natural to the body. Now, the same thing cannot be said of other substances like turpentine or gasoline, because those substances, even though they are liquids, they are unnatural to the body. And so when they are put inside the body, they become poison to the body. Now, natural laws determine the environment consistent with the nature of a thing. So the nature of a thing is actually a predictor of the natural laws that it must submit to. Some of these things sound like repetition, but in isolation, they are very instructive and they are far-reaching in their natures. It's as though I'm talking in terms of zeros and ones in computing. I'm trying to break them down to almost the barest minimum level possible, so that we can begin to build on the simplicity of these things. Everything must relate to its natural environment in order to survive and thrive. I've said that before. A plant must relate to the soil in order to survive. The fish must relate to water in order to survive. The beast of the field must relate to the field in order to survive. In other words, there is that law of the product and its environment that guarantees survival and success. So the same thing we have to say about man. Man is naturally created to live and thrive on earth within the conditions of earth. Why? Oxygen, for example, is a law. It's a natural law for the human, in fact, for plants and for animals. Just like carbon dioxide is a natural law for plants. Right, let's break this down to law and society, especially from the perspective of the kingdom. When I say kingdom, I'm talking about the kingdom of God, which is itself is a community, which is a government, which is a nation. Now, the purpose of law is to create community. How is that? Without law, it is impossible to have a community. Community, you can see a word there that says unity. We cannot have unity of a group of people if there is no law that governs their existence. So community is produced by common law that every individual in that environment submits to, agrees to keep, right? Common law creates common culture. That stands to reason. Common law, if we have the same law in terms of how we dress, how we speak, the language that we use, how we see life, what we eat, and so on and so forth, how we treat our families, then naturally we have a common culture, because culture, as a matter of fact, is built out of law. So it then means that obedience or disobedience, or disobedience of law, will equally create and reinforce culture. So if we have common law that guarantees our common culture, so if we obey those common laws, then we know that we will have a strong culture. If certain elements in our environment say no, we're not going to go about it along with these laws, then naturally we begin to have disintegration in society. Okay. Now, something come to mind. I was just remembering when the Israelites were traveling out of Egypt and going to a land of their own. The first thing that was presented to them was law. That's why it was Joshua who was given that instruction. He said, "Look, this book of law, this constitution, must be in the mind, in the heart, on the lips, on the doorpost, everywhere visible for everyone, because this will produce a culture, a kingdom of people that will be distinct from the rest of the nations." So we can say then that culture is as strong as the individuals who obey or disobey the law. So the more people who obey the law, then the stronger the culture becomes. The more people who go away from the law of the community, the weaker the culture becomes. Okay, now we're obviously talking tonight about the spirit of law. But before we go into that, I want us to look at what we call the legal code or written law. Why is it necessary to have law written down? Because I was just thinking about it. The animals don't have any law written down that they need to go and observe before they um, form their own communities. The plants don't have any written law. So it is quite evident that man is the only being that actually has written law. And when we say written law, we have that maybe in the context of our nations, of our corporations, and so on, but not so much in terms of our individuals, not so much in the context of individuals. And I was just saying that the other time, that if somebody talks to me in a particular way, I can react if I think the way I'm spoken to is disrespectful. Why is that? There is a law that is unwritten that tells me that I should be treated with respect. And so if that is violated, even though it is not written, uh, I will react and say, no, I object to being spoken to in that way. So, but because as we have communities, then then there's the tendency to have so many private laws so that we don't even know what to obey. And then if a stronger group of people come about, they can say, well, we can impose our own law on some other people because of strength or of power. So which means weaker people they'll probably stand no chance. Now, sometimes in order to mitigate this, that's why we have written law. Why? Because man's ability to exercise independent will actually necessitate written law, the putting law in writing. Okay. Now, written laws actually are intended to establish common laws by which a society functions. So, which means a society cannot really function unless there is some kind of reference, some reference point that they can all look to and say, all right, we will live by this. And so, whether you're weak or strong, poor or rich, this is something that will govern all of us. Written laws, they actually exist to establish the codes of acceptable social culture. So we can say that written laws actually create what we refer to as normal in a society. So if a written law or written code of law state a particular thing, then it means within that society we would treat those things as being normal. So the purpose of law, of written law, is first and foremost to inform. As in the case of law takes very different forms in codification. For example, when we drive on the road, we can have a law that just writes 30. It says no more than that, but it says 30. It's codified in number, and then you may have a symbol around it, which everyone who drives on that road has to abide by. We may have something on certain land that says, do not cross the lawn. Now, as far as that society is concerned, it becomes abnormal. It becomes a thing to object to if somebody begins to cross the lawn. So as long as people abide by that, then we begin to create what we call habitual norm. So law or written law actually exists to inform, to remind, and to regulate behavior in order to create habitual norms. Now, when we begin to talk about law, there is a tendency to think, hey, are we resorting to legalism? I mean, what are we doing? Are we trying to say that we've got to be, are we taking ourselves back to legalism? Especially from, the kingdom context. Sometimes when people who are maybe in religious society, they think about this, especially possibly in the Christian religion, they probably think, no, we are already free from law. Now we have grace. Well, let's talk briefly about that, to look at law and legalism. Now, when the written codes and when the codes of written law become more important than the intent of law, problems arise. And that's when we look at the just what they call the letters of the law, and we think, no, we must do this. And unless we do that, we just abide by it as it is written, then sometimes people are punished for not abiding by the very letters of the law. And we say that legalism is actually the prioritization of the codes of law over the intent of law. When we say intent of law, what do we mean? We're talking about what was the purpose of the written law. Every law is written for a reason. Now, what is the reason of that law? What was the law intended to achieve? So if we say that I have to wash my hands a few times before I eat, now, what are we trying to get at? Is it just the practice, the code of washing hands, or the intent to establish hygiene? So now we can see now that when legalism, which takes over the codes of law, then we begin to lose the intent. So whenever practices are more important than the principle or the principles of the practices, legalism results. So which means if we look at just the washing of hands over and above what the principle of washing of hand is, then we automatically move into the realms of legalism. Now, as practices, the thing we know is that as generations come after one another, we actually carry on certain practices, certain ideas. We transmit them to the coming generations. So and that's how we have what we call tradition, which is simply the trading of ideas and practices over generations. So as practices are traded over generations, where people somehow focus on the practices of the law, where something begins to happen, which is that the principle of law begins to become a distant memory. It becomes lost over time. So you know, there is something that a kind of hilarious thing that I had a while ago. There was this young couple who got married, and they, maybe just few days into marriage, were just sort of trying to prepare breakfast. So this time it was the lady's turn to do so. So she went into the kitchen and she took sausage and just cut the top and the bottom of the sausage, and then just threw it into the saucepan and begin to fry. All right. So the young man just thought, wow, this looks like we're wasting some of this food. So, well, he ignored it. But after a while, it happened again. And so he just kind of said, well, honey, why did you cut the tip of the sausage? And she said, well, that's how my mom did it. Okay. So, well, one of these days afterwards, they were invited to the family, the parents' family, for some kind of event. So mom too this time was preparing breakfast, and she took the sausage and just cut off the top and the bottom. And so the guy was saying, wow, so it's not right. So what my wife said is actually true. So he said, Mom, I noticed my wife also does something like this. So, and you also do it. So why is it? I said, well, I'm not quite sure, but well, my mom used to do that as well. So the grandmother translated it or transferred it to the child, who translated to now to the young wife. Luckily, the grandmother was still alive. And so when the appropriate time uh, came, this young man asked the grandmother and said, well, Grandma, why do you also cut your sausage? And she said, well, if you look at my saucepan, they're quite small. So it just wouldn't normally fit in. So that's why I cut the sausage so that it can fit in. Now, I mean, think about it. The young woman or the generations after, they have bigger saucepan and still are cutting the saucepan and the sausage. So that's what we mean by when ideas are traded over generations. The principle of it becomes a distant memory and sometimes becomes entirely lost. And so that brings us to ritual laws. Why last week we said something about ritual laws, and it sounded a bit harsh, but what do we mean by ritual laws, and why are ritual laws undesirable? One of the things we see about ritual laws is that they tend to focus on methods rather than the substance. So it's more about, well, this is how to do it, and not so much about why you do it. So ritual laws prioritize what over why. Ritual laws focus on practices over and above principles. And that's why they can get done and people can become so legalistic. In fact, ritual laws in nearly all cases tend towards legalism because the focus is on this is how you should do it. And don't ask questions, just do it. And not so much about why you should do it or the principle of the practice. So practices of ritual laws become traditions as they are traded through successive generations. And again, as the practices of ritual laws are traded over generations, what you find is that the principles thereof are lost, leaving generations following with nothing but codes of practice. And that's why I remember the time when, Jesus, for example, encountered a lot of this when he would deal with the teachers of the law of his day. And it was a constant conflict because they would say, well, why did your own students not wash their hands before they ate? Because we've been doing this for 4,000 years. So why would you just show up and do something different? And he said, well, the principle of it is this. It's not so much about washing hands or not washing hands. It's about the fact that we're trying to establish cleanliness, hygiene, and the fact that we wanted to reinforce into your mind that nothing should purify your internal self. Okay. Now, we talk about the spirit of law from this context now, that the spirit of law is actually the intent of law. So when we say no, the intent of law, what we're simply referring to is the spirit of law. Now, we hear a lot of this in the law courts when a judge might say, well, according to the spirit of the law, this is exactly what we should do. So the spirit of the law actually reinforces the intent of the law. Is actually the reason why law was given in the first place. I'm going to mention some of them, some of these, some laws in contrast, especially as we see them in the Holy Scriptures, and just to see and to kind of highlight uh, the the spirit of the law as opposed to just the legal code of the law. Now, the spirit of law is the principle of law that makes the letters or the codes of the law meaningful. So, without the spirit of the law, the meaning of the law is actually law. So, the spirit of the law restores meaning to the letters of law. So, which means unless we get back into the spirit of law, we more or less lose the intent and the meaning of law. But the problem is that the spirit of law, or what we call the meaning of law, is something that resides not just in the legal code, but in the mind of those that wrote the law. So, for example, when, for example, in America, we say they say we the people. What was in the mind of the original writers of the law? Okay. Now, unless there's some way to be able to recapture the mind of the people that wrote the law, then the original meaning, the original intent of that law will be lost. So the spirit of the law actually restores life to the letters of the law. Now, we've had something that says that the letter kills, but the spirit gives life. That's exactly what is meant. That the spirit of the law, when understood, restores true meaning to the letters of the law. So the spirit of the law contains the character of the law. What do we mean by that? When we understand the spirit of the law, then we can understand how that law is meant to function, what that law is meant to achieve, and what attitude that law is meant to produce. Now, talking about the intent of the law, the meaning of law resides in the mind of the person that gives the law. That's why I was saying that, when you read a particular law, maybe laws that have been around for hundreds of years, mostly because of time, the original idea, the intent of the law, the circumstance of the law, what the German would call the Sitzenleben, what produced the law, the circumstance in life that produced the law, would have been forgotten only because of time. And unless that was documented or captured in some way, then the meaning of that law will be lost only because the original meaning resides in the mind of the person that gives the law. So what does that mean? Relationship with the lawgiver is necessary for reconnection with the spirit of the law. So unless there's some way to relate back to the mind of the person that gave the law, then it's impossible to understand the spirit of the law. Now, knowledge of the spirit of law produces the intended character of the law. I mentioned that in the previous slide. So now it also stands to reason that ignorance of the spirit of law does not in any way change the principle of the law. So the fact that we may not know the intent of the law does not change the original principle of it. It just means that the present handler, the present people who are handling the law are just totally ignorant of what the actual meaning of the law is. Okay, I'm going to say this in context so that we can drive this home. Now, the other thing is that time does not in any way change the spirit of law. Time does not in any way change the spirit of law. As a matter of fact, time can only make it more relevant. Time can only reinforce it and make it more relevant, because it does not in any way change the intent of the law. Okay, now Still talking about the intent of the law, I want to highlight the fact that even tradition and popular culture do not in any way change the original intent of law. You know, sometimes because things get traded over time, and then other cultures are produced as a result of perhaps misunderstanding of the intent of the law. Now, those cultures that emanate over time or afterwards are not enough to actually change the meaning and the intent of law. Now, this is very instructive because there are connotations to this, which we'll be looking at as we go on. So, in any way, and we also say that, tradition and popular culture do not change the intent of law just by way of repetition. Now, genuine laws only, when we know genuine laws, only then can we actually begin to correct attitude. Or let me put it another way. Genuine attitude corrections can only occur when the spirit of law is restored. In fact, we can extend that by saying that character and right attitudes depend on restoring the spirit of law. So, which means unless we know the original intent, then our behaviors will be different. Let me give you an example. When we hear something like an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, now the attitude is that, well, I should avenge anything that is done against me. That's the bottom line of that. So the character is that of vengeance. The attitude is that of retribution. But you will hear it when Jesus said, well, it's not so much of an eye for an eye, but just forgive it. Now, the intent of that law was not to destroy the body of human parts. I mean, the parts of human body, or was not to destroy another person. It's more of to restore value to each person and to the part of the body. It's not so much to destroy people, but to protect people. So when they say, look, we will take your eye if you take somebody else's eye, is to say that you must be careful to make sure you do not harm anybody, only because the only thing that can restore the part of the body that is missing is another part of the body. In other words, it is to protect the sanctity of life. Sometimes we see the laws that said in the Old Testament of scriptures, and they sound very harsh. It will say something like this, that whoever takes the life of a man has to pay back with his own life. So what do we have? So we have two people that are killed. Now, is that the intent of that law? Is that the character that law is meant to produce? No. Jesus came around and said, hey, you've had this, but forgive your enemy. And it says something like that. Now, the point of capital punishment, which that life for life talks about, is to actually protect the sanctity of life, not the destruction of life. And that says it this way, that the only thing that can truly repay the life of a human being is another life. So in that sense, we all must respect the lives of our fellow human beings to the point of protecting them, because only another life can truly replace or measure up to the life of a human being. So the intent of capital law is not destruction of law of lives, but protection of life. So, and I say this way, that the further executors of law are from the source of divine laws, the higher the likelihood of miscarriage of justice. So if all we're left with is just the legal code that says, well, an eye for an eye, then which means, well, you just keep plucking eyes away. Okay, now let me quickly talk about kingdom law and the concept of grace. I was looking up grace today, and I saw a few meanings. One of them is permission, one of them is help, one of them is enablement or empowerment. So, and the first thing I'm going to say is that true laws can never be abolished. I'm talking about divine laws, the laws that uh, that God Himself set and established in life. They cannot be abolished.